In today's African folktale you will see what their slay queen neighbor secretly does to their son when they go to work. And then ask yourself, how well do you really know the people around your child? Keep watching, this could save someone you love.
Agozi Nduka was a lively primary 5 boy who loved running around, torn between his passion for basketball and reading adventure books. Every 3:16 p.m., as the school bus dropped him and drive off with a low, steady rumble, Agozi stood at the gate of his home, watching it disappear down the road. The noise of the engine faded, and in its place a heavy silence filled the air. He felt something around him that was strange and uncomfortable. The silence made the house behind him seem even emptier, and this is because he would be home all by himself until 9 hours, when his parents got back from their restaurant. The house was clean but strangely silent, missing the warmth of his parents' laughter. Many parents work tirelessly to provide a good life for their children, believing they're safe in the hands of a friendly neighbor. Mr. and Mrs. Nduka invested their entire energy into their ever-busy restaurant, their hands moving like skilled chefs, sorting, selling, and counting, while their voices blended into the lively clatter of daily trade, like the rhythmic clinking of plates, the sizzle of hot oil, and the constant chatter of hungry customers placing their orders. They worked tirelessly, their love evident in the food on the table and the crisp school uniform he wore. But love, Agozi was learning, did not always fill the silence. "Mom, I'm home," Agozi called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. Silence met him, thick and heavy, stretching down the empty hallways. He waited, hoping, just maybe, today would be different. But there was no warm embrace, no laughter, no hurried footsteps rushing to greet him. Just the distant hum of the ceiling fan and the quiet creak of the front door as it settled into place. He sighed, dropping his school bag onto the floor. He wished they could see him, really see him. The way he weaved through defenders on the basketball court, the thrill of the ball swishing through the net. The way his heart raced when he turned the pages of his favorite story, feeling the adventure come alive. But instead, his victories belonged to no one but himself, swallowed by the silence of an empty home. Then one evening, as he sat picking at his dinner, his mother's eyes softened with an idea. "Agozi," she said, setting down her spoon, "why don't we ask Miss Linda, who lives 2 blocks away, to look after you until we get back? That way you won't be so bored staying here by yourself." Agozi hesitated for a moment before nodding. He knew Miss Linda well. Everyone in the compound did. She was a vibrant woman in her late 20s, with a laugh that rang like wind chimes, and a kitchen that always smelled of something delicious. She had a way of making people feel seen, truly seen, and for a boy who spent too many afternoons in silence, that meant everything. The first time he stepped into her small but cozy home after school, the scent of freshly cooked jollof rice wrapped around him like a warm embrace. "Ah, my superstar is here," she beamed, pulling him into a tight hug. "Come, come. I made something special today." Just as he was about to respond, a voice cut through the air. "So this is the famous Agozi?" Agozi turned to see a boy, maybe a year or 2 older, lounging on the couch with a half-eaten mango in his hand. His sharp eyes studied Agozi with quiet curiosity. "This is Tobe," Miss Linda said with a smile, ruffling the boy's hair. "My little cousin from the village. He'll be staying with me for a while." Toby didn't smile back. Instead, he wiped his sticky fingers on his shorts and smirked. "You play b-ball, right? Let's see if you're as good as they say." Agozi met his gaze, a flicker of challenge sparking between them. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something more than loneliness. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Agozi kicked off his sandals at the doorway, the rich aroma of spiced egusi soup and pounded yam pulling him into Miss Linda's small but inviting home. He found her at the stove, humming a tune, as she stirred a bubbling pot. "Miss Linda, how was your day?" he asked, his voice steadier now, his usual shyness dissolving in the warmth of her presence. She turned, beaming, her laughter like sunlight spilling through the room. "Ah, much better now that my little champion is here. Sit, sit, you must be starving." She set a plate of steaming spiced egusi soup, pounded yam, and grilled chicken before him, the kind that made his stomach growl the moment he caught a whiff. He grinned as he picked up his spoon, but just as he was about to dig in, a voice interrupted. "He gets special treatment now?" Agosi looked up to find Toby leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, one brow raised. The older boy had settled into Miss Linda's home over the past few weeks, but unlike Agosi, he wasn't always warm. There was something guarded about him, something that made Agosi unsure whether to call him a friend or a rival. Miss Linda shot Toby a playful glare. "Ah, jealous. You're my first rascal, don't worry." Toby smirked, plopping onto the couch. "He doesn't look like a champion to me. I bet he's never beaten anyone in a real match." Agosi paused mid-bite, glancing at Miss Linda, who only shook her head with amusement. "Eat first, compete later," she said, ruffling Agosi's hair. As the days turned into weeks, Agosi found himself settling into the rhythm of this new life. Miss Linda was more than just a babysitter. She became his safe haven. She watched movies with him, shared stories of her childhood, and even surprised him one evening with a small wrapped box. "Go on, open it," she urged, eyes twinkling. Agosi peeled away the paper and gasped. A leather basketball. A real one. "Miss—" "This is too much," he stammered, his chest tight with emotion. She waved him off. "Nonsense. Every boy deserves to have fun, especially one as kind as you." Agosi clutched the ball, swallowing hard. No one had ever given him a gift like this. "You're like the little brother I never had," she added softly. Before he could respond, Toby scoffed. "Basketball, huh? Hope you're really better at that." Agosi met his gaze, a challenge sparking between them. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd have to prove himself. Agosi had grown comfortable in Miss Linda's home, wrapped in the warmth of her laughter and the ease of her kindness. Each afternoon the smell of her cooking welcomed him, and the sound of her stories filled the quiet spaces in his heart. Even Toby, with his smirks and taunts, had become a familiar presence, an older boy who challenged him in ways that kept him sharp. But then, one evening, something changed. Miss Linda's usual cheer dimmed as she sat beside him on the couch, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Agosi, I have a special game for us, just for us. No one else can know." Agosi stiffened. There was something in the way she spoke, something secretive, urgent. A game? He loved games, but why did this one need to be a secret? His fingers twitched as she reached for his hands, guiding them in a way that made his stomach twist. He didn't understand. A heavy silence settled between them, thick like harmattan fog. Toby, who had been lounging by the door, suddenly straightened. His sharp eyes flicked from Miss Linda to Agosi, his usual smirk fading. "What kind of game?" he asked, his voice laced with something Agosi had never heard before. Concern. Miss Linda's head snapped up. "Mind your business, Toby." Agosi swallowed, his heart hammering in his chest. The room, once filled with warmth, now felt too small, too tight. His mind raced, searching for an answer, for a way to understand what was happening. And then, for the first time, he wished he wasn't here. Agosi's hands trembled as he pushed his untouched plate of egusi soup around with his cutlery. The weight of his secret pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Confusion washed over him as she guided his hands in ways he didn't understand. "Miss, I don't like this game," he protested one afternoon, his small heart racing with worry. "Don't worry, you'll come to enjoy it," she reassured him, but the anxious knot in his stomach tightened. The more they played, the more he dreaded returning to her home. Each afternoon at Miss Linda's house had become a battle between fear and confusion. He no longer rushed to her door, no longer looked forward to the stories and games. The air in her home felt different now, thicker, darker, filled with thoughts that made his skin crawl. One afternoon, as she reached for his hand again, in an instant, he yanks his hand back, his eyes widening with unease. His body stiffens, shoulders rising as if bracing for something. The space between them now feels like a chasm, thick with something unspoken but undeniable. "Miss, I don't like this game," he blurted out, his voice shaky but firm. For a fraction of a second, her carefully composed expression cracks. Her lips, once curled in a warm smile, falter just slightly. Her eyes flicker with something unspoken as if caught off guard. But just as quickly as it appeared, the moment vanishes. With a soft chuckle, she regains her composure, tilting her head slightly as if nothing had happened. "Shh, Agozi," she cooed, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. "You'll come to enjoy it. You just need time." But he didn't want time. He wanted out. One morning as they both waited for the school bus, Toby leaned in and whispered, "I know." Agozi stiffened. "Know what?" Toby exhaled slowly. "I know what you're feeling, what she's doing to you. You don't have to carry it alone." Agozi's eyes widened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The dread followed him home, clinging to him like an unwanted shadow. That evening, he sat beside his mother as she folded freshly laundered clothes, her fingers moving quickly, her mind already lost in tomorrow's tasks. "Mom!" His voice barely made it past his lips. She hummed in response, not looking up. He hesitated. Words swirled inside him, desperate to be spoken, but something held them back. A fear that if he said them out loud, everything would change. Toby's voice echoed in his head. "Say something, Agozi." Swallowing the lump in his throat, he tried again. "Mom, can we talk?" This time she paused, glancing at him with tired but attentive eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Agozi opened his mouth, but the word stuck. He could feel his heartbeat thumping in his ears. Would she believe him? Would she understand? Or worse, would she tell him to stay quiet? Agozi swallowed hard, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. This was his moment, his chance to say something, to make it stop. "Mom, can we talk?" His voice was small, hesitant, but filled with quiet urgency. Mrs. Enduka barely looked up from her phone, her brows furrowed in concentration. "Not now, Agozi. I'm busy." Her tone was distracted, dismissive, like she hadn't noticed the storm raging inside him. "We'll talk later, okay?" But later never came. The words curdled in his throat, sinking deep into the pit of his stomach, mixing with the shame, the fear, the loneliness. He nodded, forcing himself to swallow back everything he had been about to say. The walls of the house, once just silent, now felt suffocating. His father came home late, exhausted from the restaurant. His mother, always preoccupied, never seemed to see him. Not really. And so, Agozi carried his secret alone, his small shoulders bending under a weight too heavy for any child to bear. That night, as he lay curled beneath his blanket, he heard a soft knock on his window. "Toby?" Agozi pushed the curtain aside, and there, crouched in the moonlight, was his best friend. Toby's face was scrunched with worry, his breath fogging up the glass. Did you tell her? Toby quietly asked. Agozi shook his head. His throat felt tight, his chest aching. Toby exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across his face. You have to, Agozi. You can't keep this inside. As soon as Tobe left for his home, Agozi went back to his bed, staring at the ceiling. The words were still there, trapped inside him like a caged bird. But what if no one ever listened? The nights became his enemy. Every night, Agozi would wake up drenched in cold sweat, the dampness of his bed clinging to him like a second skin. The shame was unbearable. He scrubbed his sheets in secret, terrified that his mother would find out. He stuffed his mattress with layers of clothing, desperate to hide the evidence. But nothing could wash away the feeling that something inside him was breaking, slowly, quietly, like a thread unraveling. At school, Agozi sits among his classmates, but he is not with them. The world blurred. His classmates occasionally burst into laughter at jokes, their voices ringing through the air, but Agozi remains still. His laughter, once bright and carefree, faded into silence. His grades slipped. The basketball no longer felt right during practice. When his friends called his name, it took him a moment to remember how to answer. The coach shouts instructions. Sneakers skid. The air is charged with movement and competition. Yet Agozi stands still. The game moves forward, but Agozi feels like he's already left it behind. Mrs. Williams, Agozi's class teacher, had spent over 2 decades in the classroom, a steadfast presence in the lives of countless children. She was known not just for her sharp intellect and firm but kind demeanor, but also for her unwavering commitment to standing up for the vulnerable. To the students who know her, this is who she is: a protector, a force against injustice, a teacher who sees and cares beyond the books and lessons. She carried a secret burden of her own, a childhood characterized by the same kind of suffering that now dimmed Agozi's once bright spirit. It was that past that made her eyes keen, always watching, always noticing. In other words, when she looks at Agozi, she sees herself. Agozi had always been a lively child, his laughter once filling the corridors of the school like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. But lately something had changed. His uniform, once crisp and tidy, was often rumpled. He no longer met her gaze when she spoke to him, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he was somewhere far away even when he was sitting right in front of her. The subtle tremor in his hands when answering a question, the way he shrank away from sudden movements, these were not the signs of mere shyness. They were the echoes of something deeper, something Mrs. Williams recognized all too well. She has seen this before, lived it before. She will not ignore this, not again. She had noticed the bruises, not physical ones, but the kind that settled into a child's spirit, dulling their light. At first she told herself that she could be wrong, but the more she watched Agozi, the more certain she became. Mrs. Williams watched him closely. "Agozi, you seem different lately," she said one afternoon, her voice gentle yet firm. "Is everything all right?" He stood before her, shifting from foot to foot, his fingernails digging into his palm. The words were there, crowding his throat, desperate to be freed, but they never made it past his lips. "I'm fine," he muttered, staring at the floor. Mrs. Williams's eyes lingered on him. She had seen this before, the quiet withdrawal, the forced smiles, the weight no child should carry. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to his height. "Agozi," she said softly, "you can always talk to me, no matter what it is." He nodded quickly, too quickly, before scurrying away, but as he walked back to his seat, he felt the heat of her gaze still on him, watchful, unwavering, and for the first time the thought crossed his mind, maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. As for Tobe, he had seen the signs before. He knew the hollow look in Agozi's eyes, the way he recoiled from sudden touch, the way his clothes seemed slightly disheveled, as if he were trying to shrink into himself. Toby recognized it because he had once lived it, thanks to Auntie Linda. Tobe's parents lived in the village, too far to notice the things that had happened to him in her house. He had been younger then, trusting, unaware that not all adults had good intentions. When the night visit started, he had buried his face in his pillow, praying that it would stop. But there had been no Mrs. Williams for him, no one to notice, no one to fight for him. The days melted into a shapeless fog. School, forced smiles, the pit in his stomach growing deeper with every step toward Miss Linda's house. Then, one afternoon, something changed. She had just drawn the curtains, casting the small room in dim, golden light. The television murmured in the background, but Agosi's ears rang with something louder, his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. Then it happened. His body reacted in a way that made his skin crawl, confusion and fear wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His breath hitched, his fingers dug into his palms, and before he could stop himself, the words burst out. "I don't want to play anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "It makes me feel bad." Mrs. Linda's smile wavered just for a second, a crack in her perfectly painted mask. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed it over, her voice dripping with practiced calm. "You're just going through a phase, Agosi. It's normal," she said. But the words felt wrong, hollow, like a spoonful of spoiled milk forced down his throat. The walls of the room felt tighter, pressing in on him, the air too thick, too heavy. Then a sound, 3 sharp knocks on the door. Agosi flinched. Mrs. Linda's expression darkened for the briefest moment before she turned toward the door, her voice laced with forced cheerfulness. "Who is it?" A pause, then a familiar voice. "Mrs. Williams." "Agosi," she called, her tone firm but gentle. "Are you there?" Agosi's throat dried up, his heart pounded. Miss Linda didn't move right away. Instead, she turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Agosi's, something unspoken but dangerous flickering behind them. And in that moment, Agosi knew. This was his chance. His only chance. That night, Agosi curled into himself beneath the thin sheets, his body racked with silent sobs. The shadows on the ceiling seemed to press down on him, and the walls of his room felt smaller than ever. He wished his parents would knock on his door, sit on the edge of his bed, stroke his hair, and ask him what was wrong. But the house remained silent except for the distant hum of his mother's television and the occasional clatter of his father's movements in the kitchen. He clenched his fists. He couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't bear another afternoon in that house, another forced game, another suffocating lie. The decision settled in his chest like a tiny flame, a fragile, flickering thing, but warm enough to fight the cold fear inside him. The next morning, with his school bag slung over his shoulder and his heart pounding against his ribs, Agosi made a choice. He would tell Mrs. Williams. The day dragged on, every lesson a blur of jumbled words and scribbles on the chalkboard. His hands felt clammy, his throat dry. His stomach twisted each time he imagined the words leaving his mouth. Finally, the last bell rang. The other children spilled into the sunlit corridors, their laughter bouncing off the walls. But Agosi didn't join them. Instead, he made his way to the front of the classroom, his feet heavy as if wading through water. Mrs. Williams was gathering her books, but when she noticed him standing there, wringing his hands, she paused. "Agosi?" she said gently. "Everything okay?" He glanced over his shoulder. A few students still lingered near the doorway, chatting idly. Anyone could be listening. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Mrs. Williams, I need to talk," he murmured. The concern in her eyes deepened. "What's the matter?" He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. "It's Miss Linda," he began, barely above a whisper. She does things to me." The words left his mouth like a stone rolling off a cliff, heavy, irreversible. For a moment Mrs. Williams said nothing. Then, ever so slowly, she set her books down. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but her eyes burned with something Agozi couldn't quite name. "Agozi," she said, her tone calm but urgent, "I need you to tell me everything." Mrs. Williams listened in silence, her chest tightening with every word that tumbled from Agozi's lips. The boy's small hands gripped the hem of his uniform, his knuckles white. His voice wavered, and yet he pushed through, spilling the horror he had endured. When he finally stopped, his eyes brimming with unshed tears, Mrs. Williams forced herself to remain composed, though her hands trembled as she reached for his. "You did the right thing, Agozi," she said, her voice thick with emotion. No one should ever make you feel this way." She knew this would not be easy. There would be doubts, reluctance, and ugly rumors, but Agozi was a child. He had suffered enough, and she would not let his voice be swallowed by silence. The school head called an emergency meeting with Agozi's parents. When Mr. and Mrs. Nduka arrived, their expressions were a mixture of confusion and irritation, their minds still tethered to the demands of their shop. "This had better be important," Mr. Nduka muttered under his breath as they took their seats. Mrs. Williams wasted no time. She recounted Agozi's words with measured precision, each syllable slicing through the tense air like a blade. At first there was silence. Then Mrs. Nduka let out a brittle laugh, shaking her head as if to rid herself of the ridiculous accusation. "There must be a mistake," she said quickly. "Linda has been nothing but kind to him." But when she turned to her son, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a sorrow too heavy for a 10-year-old to bear, something inside her cracked. "Agozi," she called out. He didn't look up. She reached for him, her fingers trembling as they touched his shoulder. "My baby, why didn't you tell me?" Agozi's voice was barely audible. "I tried, Mama, but you never had time." The words struck like a hammer to her chest. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she pulled him into a crushing embrace. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I should have listened. I should have seen." Mr. Nduka, usually a man of few words, clenched his jaw. His hands balled into fists, anger warring with guilt. He had trusted Linda. He had let this happen. "We have to go to the police," Mrs. Williams said firmly. "Now." At the station the reception was lukewarm. The officers exchanged glances, skepticism in their eyes. "This is a serious accusation," one of them said, leaning back in his chair. "Are you sure the boy isn't just confused?" Rage burned in Mrs. Williams's chest. "Are you suggesting he made this up?" she snapped. "It's not that, madam," the officer said, sighing. "But these cases are complicated. There needs to be proof." Mrs. Nduka, her earlier doubt now replaced with fury, slammed her palm on the desk. "My son is not lying." The commotion drew the attention of a senior officer, an older man with sharp, knowing eyes. He studied Agozi for a long moment before nodding. "We will investigate," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument.